What happens when one of Hollywood's most volatile performers ends up face to face with daytime television's most polarizing voice, and a routine appearance meant to highlight a new release spirals into one of the most intense clashes ever seen on live TV? Viewers were about to see a side of Nicolas Cage rarely displayed in public, raw and unfiltered, with every word landing harder than expected. From the moment he entered the View studio, there was a charged energy in the air, the kind that made even casual banter feel loaded with meaning. The set hummed with anticipation as Cage took his seat, his trademark intensity unmistakable even while exchanging pleasantries with the panel. He was there to discuss his latest thriller, a project he had poured himself into, but the conversation quickly veered off course. Joy Behar leaned forward with a familiar grin that hinted at provocation rather than curiosity. She brought up his past financial issues, referencing extravagant purchases and framing them as reckless excess. The words hung heavy, and the atmosphere cooled instantly. Cage's expression tightened, subtle but telling, though his reply stayed calm. He explained that life choices are rarely simple, that risks come with both rewards and failures, and that mistakes are part of being human. Behar laughed it off, turning to the audience and reframing his explanation as absurd, mocking his more infamous acquisitions as symbols of irresponsibility rather than ambition. The crowd reacted with uneasy murmurs, unsure whether to laugh or brace themselves. Across the table, Whoopi Goldberg shifted in her chair, sensing the growing strain. She attempted to redirect the discussion back to the film, suggesting a focus on the work at hand. Her effort barely slowed the momentum. Behar pressed on, broadening her critique to include Cage's filmography, dismissing several roles as questionable and trivial. She singled out one performance in particular, framing it as proof that his career choices had veered into self-parody. Cage leaned forward, his eyes sharpening, the spark everyone recognized beginning to flare. He pointed out the irony of being judged by someone whose profession revolved around commentary rather than creation. The studio fell silent, cameras steady but operators visibly tense. Behar's smile wavered before hardening again, her response sharper, ridiculing his acting style in iconic moments that had long been part of pop culture. He answered without retreat, his voice rising slightly as conviction took over. Every role, he said, had been chosen with intention. Each performance represented a willingness to commit fully, to step into uncertainty rather than remain safe and detached. He contrasted that approach with what he saw as cheap criticism delivered from behind a desk, aimed at those willing to put themselves on the line. Sarah Haynes tried to interject, attempting to steer the exchange back toward the new project. Before she could finish, Behar cut in again, suggesting that Cage never truly transformed, that he simply showed up as an exaggerated version of himself. The remark struck a nerve. Cage's posture changed, tension coiling through him as his voice dropped to a low, deliberate tone. He spoke about acting as truth rather than spectacle, as a search for honesty that exposes vulnerability. To him, the craft demanded courage and total commitment, something not easily understood by those who never step into that arena. Behar reacted with theatrical impatience, dismissing his words and comparing him unfavorably to legends like Marlon Brando, reducing his career to a collection of loud moments and blockbuster cliches. Cage fired back, pointing out that while his roles might be bold or unconventional, they were never half-hearted. He took pride in giving everything to a performance instead of sitting in judgment of others. The other hosts attempted to calm the exchange, but the argument had taken on a life of its own, unstoppable and escalating. Behar bristled, defending her career and longevity in the industry, listing the serious work she had done and the scrutiny she faced daily. Cage responded by drawing a clear line between criticism earned through creation and criticism born from tearing others down. He stood slightly, emphasizing that difference, his words cutting through the studio like a blade. Behar slammed her hand on the table, insisting that honesty required calling out what she viewed as ridiculous choices, even naming films like Ghost Rider as examples. Cage did not back down, his eyes blazing as he held his ground, the confrontation frozen in a moment that felt less like television and more like a collision between two irreconcilable views of art, responsibility, and respect. What kind of grown person thought that was ever a smart decision? Cage's voice dropped into a low, chilling calm that felt far more threatening than shouting ever could. He leaned slightly forward and said that he was finally starting to understand why so many viewers instinctively reach for the remote whenever Joy begins to speak. A sharp gasp rippled through the studio audience, the weight of the comment landing instantly. The remark about people changing the channel hit hard, and it showed. Joy Behar cycled through shock, anger, and a flash of real hurt before settling into a rigid, defiant glare. Her voice wavered as she fired back, demanding to know if he had just taken a shot at her ratings. She reminded him that her show had survived for decades, that millions of viewers tuned in specifically to hear her opinions. Cage tilted his head slightly, studying her with the same focused intensity he usually reserved for his most dramatic scenes. He responded that longevity meant little if the platform was being used to attack guests instead of fostering thoughtful discussion. He asked when she had last created something that brought genuine joy rather than simply provoking outrage. Joy snapped back that she created conversation, insisting she sparked dialogue about issues that mattered. The certainty she usually wielded was weaker now, her words lacking their earlier bite. Cage raised his eyebrows, clearly incredulous, and pointed out that mocking someone's career and ridiculing creative choices hardly qualified as meaningful discourse. If that was her definition of importance, he suggested, then perhaps the issue wasn't his films but her understanding of what truly mattered. Sunny Hostin attempted to step in, urging both sides to pause and breathe, but Joy cut her off sharply. She jabbed a finger toward Cage and declared she wasn't backing down. She accused him of arriving on her show with an air of artistic superiority while churning out trash for years, claiming everyone knew it and that she was simply brave enough to say it out loud. That was the moment Cage rose fully from his chair. His tall frame loomed over the table, casting a shadow as cameras zoomed in to capture every flicker of expression. His face hardened into something formidable. He repeated the word garbage with a dangerous edge that made the entire studio lean in. He explained that real garbage was tearing people down for entertainment, using influence to spread bitterness instead of celebrating creativity. Garbage, he said, was confusing cynicism with intelligence. Joy shot to her feet as well, bristling. She told him not to lecture her about wisdom, dismissing him as just an actor who pretended to be other people for money. She claimed she dealt with serious matters, real politics, real problems affecting real lives. Cage let out a sharp, humorless laugh and said her real issue seemed to be an inability to tolerate anything that didn't fit neatly into her narrow definition of acceptability. When she encountered something different or unusual, he said, her instinct was to mock it, tear it apart, and elevate herself by shrinking others. The tension in the room was suffocating. Whoopi Goldberg waved frantically toward the producers, silently pleading for intervention, but the cameras kept rolling, preserving every volatile second. Joy matched Cage's intensity, declaring that maybe mocking him was necessary. She compared his work to an Emperor's New Clothes scenario, claiming his acting amounted to yelling and exaggerated faces that somehow convinced people it was profound. Cage's voice sank again into that unsettling whisper as he responded. He said his approach came from years of study under Sanford Meisner, from immersion in method techniques and a lifetime devoted to the craft. He demanded to know what qualified her to judge artistic expression. Joy fired back that her expertise came from life experience, common sense, and the ability to call something absurd when it deserved to be called out. Cage slowly shook his head, genuine pity softening his features for just a moment. He said what was truly absurd was sitting in judgment of people brave enough to put themselves out there, to embrace vulnerability and risk failure in pursuit of meaning. He accused her of building an entire career on pointing and laughing while others actually did the work. Joy's voice climbed higher, shrill with frustration, as she scoffed at the idea of work. She mocked his most famous roles, dismissing them as overacting done for a paycheck. Cage answered coldly that at least his performances aimed to give audiences an experience, to make them feel something real. What she offered, he said, was simply cruelty dressed up as commentary. Across the table, Ana Navarro tried desperately to steer the conversation in a different direction, her voice barely cutting through the charged silence as the confrontation continued to crackle through the studio air. Nicolas, one of the other hosts, began, mentioning how much his supporters admire the total commitment he brings to every role he takes. The comment barely finished before Joy Behar cut in sharply, sneering that his fans were probably just teenagers who thought shouting automatically meant comedy. She added that grown, discerning viewers preferred nuance and refinement, not whatever theatrical excess he kept dragging onto the screen. The jab hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Cage's eyes sparked with a dangerous intensity. He repeated her words about mature audiences with clear disdain, then described her viewers as people who tuned in to watch guests get cornered, mocked, and fed to gossip. He framed it as her version of grown-up entertainment, stripping away any pretense of sophistication. Joy pushed back, insisting she bullied no one and that she simply asked difficult questions meant to hold people accountable, though the edge in her voice had begun to dull. Cage's response came fast and unrelenting. He said accountability seemed to mean punishing people for making choices she disliked, for daring to stand out, for refusing to coast safely through a career built on predictability. The accusation landed cleanly. Joy's face flushed, anger rising alongside something that looked uncomfortably close to embarrassment. She snapped that nothing about her job was safe, that enduring constant criticism from people who believed themselves superior was no easy task. Cage replied with icy calm that he did not see himself as better than everyone else, but he did see himself as better than someone who used a public platform to spread negativity and dress it up as journalism. His words cut deep. Joy's expression flickered through disbelief and genuine hurt before hardening into raw fury. She demanded to know how he dared to sit there, acting like an artistic visionary, when in her words everyone knew he was washed up and riding on family connections. The mention of Francis Ford Coppola changed everything. Cage's posture stiffened, his presence shifting into something fierce and almost frightening. When he spoke again, his voice carried controlled thunder. He repeated the phrase about coattails slowly, deliberately, each syllable heavy with venom. He said that if she wanted to turn the conversation toward family ties, then it was only fair to examine how her own career truly began and how she reached her position. For the first time, Joy's confidence faltered. She insisted it was not the same situation, but Cage stepped closer to the table, his physical presence dominating the room. From his perspective, he said, it looked like someone who had never created anything lasting was attacking a person who had devoted his entire life to his craft, then trying to deflect by making the exchange personal. Around them, any illusion of control had vanished. Whoopi Goldberg watched in stunned fascination, while Sarah Haynes covered her mouth, and the audience sat frozen, aware they were witnessing something rare and volatile. Joy's voice cracked as she claimed the fight had become personal the moment he insulted her intelligence, her career, and her viewers. She accused him of parading around as a tortured artist when, in her view, he had become a punchline. Cage let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He said the real joke was the belief that tearing others down made someone significant, that relentless cynicism somehow equaled insight. Years spent being negative, he added, had stripped her of any memory of contributing something constructive to the world. Joy shrieked back, demanding to know what was constructive about producing films she labeled terrible, about performances she described as wasted time and money, about mistaking screaming and excess for artistry. Cage slammed his hand onto the table with such force that glasses rattled and jumped. He declared that what mattered was the effort itself, the willingness to step forward, to take chances, to offer audiences experiences they had never encountered before. He admitted that failure sometimes followed, and success other times, but at least he stood in the arena rather than hiding behind a desk and taking cheap shots at those who dared to try. The allusion to Theodore Roosevelt went unnoticed by Joy, but the power of Cage's words did not. His voice swelled, filling the studio as he spoke about passion, commitment, and the refusal to play it safe in a world crowded with people who found entertainment in watching others stumble. He emphasized that every role he had ever accepted, from small independent projects to massive blockbusters, received the same respect and dedication. Joy had begun to lean back now, visibly shaken by the sheer force of his presence. She muttered that none of it erased the reality that some of his films were, in her opinion, simply bad. Cage's voice dropped once more into that low, unsettling register, the kind that carried far more weight than shouting, as he dismissed the authority behind such judgments and let the tension linger, thick and unresolved. According to you, according to critics who wouldn't recognize real artistic risk if it hit them squarely, Cage shot back with biting sarcasm. According to people who believe that playing it safe and producing predictable mediocrity somehow outweighs bold ambition that sometimes fails. Joy Behar tried to interrupt, stumbling over her words as she insisted it wasn't just her opinion. She cited audiences, box office figures, and what she called common sense, grasping for firmer ground as the argument slipped out of her control. Cage slowly shook his head, the anger in his expression giving way to something closer to disappointment. He told her she fundamentally misunderstood art, believing it should be comfortable, tidy, and risk-free. Creativity, in her view, was supposed to fit inside narrow boundaries that never challenged anyone. He said she had lived in that world for so long that she could no longer recognize authenticity even when it stood directly in front of her. At the word authenticity, Joy's voice climbed higher, edged with desperation. She mocked his lifestyle, bringing up his eccentric purchases and framing them as evidence of excess rather than individuality. To her, it was nothing more than wealthy odd behavior dressed up as meaning. The personal jab didn't wound Cage the way she seemed to expect. Instead, it energized him. When he responded, every ounce of his presence and talent came through clearly. He acknowledged that he had made unconventional choices and bought things others wouldn't even consider. He admitted that he lived differently. But he said at least he had lived, rather than spending decades judging people who dared to stand apart. At least he hadn't hidden behind carefully crafted opinions and controversy designed to be safe while pretending it was bold. Joy's hands trembled now, whether from anger or the realization that the crowd had begun to slip away from her. She insisted she wasn't hiding at all, that she simply said what needed to be said, that someone had to call out nonsense when it appeared. Cage's response exploded through the studio. He said the real nonsense was confusing destruction with criticism, mistaking cruelty for insight, and believing that tearing people down gave someone importance. He called it a tragic waste of influence to use a platform capable of celebrating creativity instead to spread bitterness and misery. The room fell into an unnatural silence. You could sense the tension hanging heavy in the air. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, reluctant to move and break the moment. Joy made one last attempt to reclaim authority, insisting she wasn't spreading misery but offering honesty about quality, refusing to pretend everything was great when it wasn't. Cage stared at her for a long stretch, long enough for discomfort to ripple across the set. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that pressed down on everyone listening. He told her the saddest part was that she truly believed what she was saying. She had convinced herself that negativity equaled honesty, that cruelty was truth, and that her inability to appreciate difference was some kind of virtue. He explained that she didn't get to decide what art meant to others or what brought meaning into someone else's life. All anyone could choose was whether to add something positive to the world or spend their time tearing down those who were actually trying to create something meaningful. He straightened to his full height, every bit the imposing figure audiences had watched for decades. He said he genuinely felt sorry for her, because somewhere along the way she had forgotten the purpose of art and entertainment. It wasn't about dominance or mockery. It was about connection, shared experience, and finding common ground in human emotion. Instead, he said, she had chosen division, ridicule, and diminishment. The truly tragic part was that she believed this approach made her important. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For perhaps the first time in her television career, she stood completely silent, unable to form a reply. Cage gathered himself, smoothing his jacket with calm composure, the posture of someone who had already said everything that needed to be said. He thanked her for having him on the show with devastating politeness and expressed hope that the audience had found whatever entertainment they were seeking. Then he turned and walked off the set, leaving Joy standing alone at the table. The camera lingered on her stunned expression for several long seconds before finally cutting away. The confrontation had already left its mark. In that moment, one voice fueled by genuine passion had collided head-on with a career built on provocation, and the imbalance was impossible to ignore.